When the muddy water came pouring over the north fence, I already knew it was not an accident. Lenora Pritchard stood on the community road above my land, arms crossed, watching my $1,000 ranch disappear under brown water, and she told me I should be grateful because she had finally washed away the eyesore behind her neighborhood. She had no idea the emergency valve she used had a camera pointed straight at it. She had no idea the water she released had just torn through a federally protected wetland. 6 months later, she walked into a courtroom smiling, certain that a man who paid $1,000 for his land could never be owed anything close to real money. When the judge read out a judgment of $25 million, that smile was the first thing to disappear. I bought Barrow Creek Ranch at a county tax foreclosure auction on a cold morning when nobody else wanted to raise a paddle. 300 acres were on the block that day, and the auctioneer barely finished his sentence before silence fell over the room. The house on the property had been rotting for over a decade. The access road turned to soup after a light rain, and most of the acreage was labeled low-lying wetland on the county survey, the kind of designation that scared away every investor in the room. The water rights attached to the deed ran over 200 pages, filled with old easements and clauses nobody wanted to spend a lawyer's hour untangling. When the number $1,000 came out of my mouth, there was no counterbid, and the gavel came down before anyone changed their mind. I did not buy that ranch to flip it. I moved into the old house within the month and spent the first winter learning every inch of the land by flashlight and by boot, mapping which fields flooded first and which ridges stayed dry no matter how hard the rain came down. Neighbors from town assumed I had lost a bet or lost my mind, since nobody in their right mind sank savings into 300 acres of tax sale mud when steadier work was available an hour away. I had spent years reading topographic surveys and water tables for other people's projects, and something about that abandoned parcel told me the county's low-lying label was hiding more value than it was revealing. Over the following 2 years, I cleared the clogged drainage channels by hand, rebuilt nearly a mile of fencing, and installed water level sensors along the creek bed so I would always know exactly how the land was behaving. I nursed a badly damaged wetland back toward health, careful never to disturb the historic water channels that had been carved into that soil since before anyone in Cedar Ridge Estates was born. The work was slow and unglamorous, the kind of labor that never shows up in a listing photo. But the creek began running clear again, frogs returned to the shallow pools by early summer, and herons started coming back to the low ground by the second spring. Cedar Ridge Estates sat on the ridge just north of my property, a gated community of manicured lawns and stone entrance columns that looked down literally and figuratively on everything below it. I met Lenora Pritchard for the first time when her white SUV rolled up to my gate one afternoon, and she asked, without so much as an introduction, when I planned to clear the salvage yard out of her residence view. She assumed I was hired help, some caretaker paid to keep an eye on land that belonged to somebody important, and she seemed almost annoyed when I told her the deed was in my name. When I walked back to the house and returned with the ownership certificate, she read it twice, laughed once, and said that buying something nobody else wanted did not make a man a rancher. I told her the county clerk's signature did not care what she thought about the price I paid. It was a small thing to say, but it landed hard in front of the 2 board members standing behind her, and I watched her jaw tighten in a way that told me I had made an enemy without meaning to. From that afternoon forward, Lenora Pritchard stopped seeing me as a poor neighbor to be pitied and started seeing me as an obstacle to be removed. I did not understand yet how far she was willing to go to remove it, but 3 weeks later she came back to my gate holding a folder, and she opened with a number instead of a greeting. She told me she had a proposal that would let me walk away in dignity instead of continuing to embarrass myself out here in the mud. She said the offer was for $40,000, a number she clearly expected to leave me speechless with gratitude, since it was 40 times what I had paid. She never once asked how many months I had spent rebuilding the fence lines or restoring the creek, because in her mind the wetland behind me was worthless swampland, and the improvements I had made were beneath consideration. I told her I would need to see exactly what the buyer intended before I considered anything. And that was when she finally admitted the offer was coming through a company called Bancroft Leisure Development. The plans she showed me were ambitious. Bancroft wanted to build a golf course, an artificial lake, a resort clubhouse, and a private access road connecting the new development straight into Cedar Ridge Estates. The engineering renderings called for filling in a long stretch of Barrow Creek to make room for a cart path and a water feature near the 18th hole. I told her I would not sign anything that required burying a live creek, and she responded the way she always responded to disagreement, by suggesting that a man in a work shirt was not qualified to evaluate a project designed by people with real vision. I asked her, plainly, why the president of a homeowners association was personally brokering land deals for an outside developer. She answered that people with vision had a duty to help a town move forward, as if she were doing Cedar Ridge a favor simply by existing in it. Within a week, official HOA notices began arriving at my mailbox, even though my land had never been part of their association and never would be. The letters claimed my fencing failed to meet a community standard, that my work truck was an eyesore, that my equipment shed violated an architectural code, and that my grass had grown past an acceptable height. None of those codes applied to a property outside their boundary lines, and I mailed back a copy of the recorded plat map along with a short request that she stop contacting me altogether. She showed up at my gate instead of writing back. She threw the paperwork onto the hood of my truck and told me I was clinging to a patch of mud because it was the only thing left that made me feel important. Not long after that visit, I noticed survey stakes appearing near the HOA's retention pond, placed by a crew working for Bancroft, and several of those stakes marked a drainage path that ran directly toward my property line. When I photographed the markers, Lenora appeared out of nowhere and ordered me to stay away from what she called private community infrastructure, even though I was standing well within my own boundary the entire time. Before she drove off that day, she looked down at the valley and said that one good storm would settle whatever her lawyers had not managed to settle yet. I wrote the sentence down that night, word for word, because something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. I pulled the public drainage plans for Cedar Ridge from the county office the following morning, and the approved design was clear. Stormwater was supposed to flow through an eastern culvert system into a licensed discharge channel, and the emergency valve pointed toward Barrow Creek was meant only for extraordinary failures of the primary system, each use required to be logged and reported. Walking the ridgeline a few days later, I found a freshly built earthen berm sealing off the eastern culvert entrance, along with a new steel pipe aimed squarely at my north fence. I photographed everything and sent it to the county engineering office, and Lenora answered on behalf of the HOA before anyone official even responded, insisting it was routine maintenance work. When I asked for a permit number, none ever came. A county hydrologist named Tate Holloway agreed to inspect the site the following week, but the forecast showed a significant storm arriving well before his scheduled visit, and that timing did not feel like coincidence to me. I spent that week installing 2 infrared cameras along the tree line, 3 additional water level sensors in the creek bed, and a flow pressure recorder tucked into a weatherproof case near the culvert. Lenora caught me working near the boundary and mocked the equipment openly, telling me a few cheap cameras did not turn a man into an engineer. She had no idea those cameras streamed live data to an off-site server every few minutes, well beyond her reach or her control. That same evening, Maris Keene, the HOA secretary, called me from a number I did not recognize and warned me that the board had just held a meeting with no official minutes taken. During that unrecorded meeting, Lenora had instructed the maintenance crew to, in her words, prepare a release option toward the south, and south meant only one place, my ranch. Maris was not ready to confront Lenora openly, but she quietly sent me a photo of the maintenance schedule, and the name Cole Dillard appeared beside a 2 a.m. shift on the night the storm was expected. I called the Regional Water Authority immediately, but they told me they could not issue any preventative order without an actual violation already in progress. I spent the rest of that day moving my laptop hard drives and anything irreplaceable up to higher ground, while leaving the sensors running exactly where they were. Late that afternoon, Lenora sent one final email demanding I accept the sale offer before midnight, closing with a line I have never forgotten. She wrote that by morning, $1,000 might be the highest that piece of land would ever be worth again. I read it twice standing in my kitchen, rain already tapping lightly on the tin roof, and I understood then that she was not simply threatening me, she was announcing something she had already set in motion. I saved the email to 3 separate places before the storm even started, a habit that would matter more than I could have imagined by morning. The rain began just before midnight, steady but nowhere near the severity the forecast had promised earlier that week. My sensors showed the retention pond sitting at roughly 42% capacity, nowhere close to any threshold that would justify an emergency release under the approved design. At 1:47 in the morning, my camera caught a maintenance truck pulling up beside the valve housing, and Cole Dillard climbed out alongside a second figure wearing a light-colored rain jacket, their face obscured by the angle and the darkness. Within minutes, the emergency valve was opened completely, while the earthen berm continued blocking the legitimate eastern discharge route exactly as it had for days. A wall of water surged down the slope directly toward my fence line, and it did not take long to see the damage unfolding in real time. I stood on the porch listening to a sound I had never heard on that land before, a low roaring hiss that grew louder with every passing minute as the current gathered speed across ground that had no way to absorb it. The north fence buckled and washed out within minutes. The tool shed flooded past its threshold. 2 years of carefully restored topsoil peeled away from the wetland surface, and the creek channel I had nursed back to health turned into a churning ribbon of construction runoff and mud. The smell hit me before I even reached the fence line, a thick chemical tang of disturbed earth and standing sediment that had no business mixing with clean creek water. I called County Emergency Services and the Regional Water Authority within the first few minutes, but I made no attempt to reach the valve myself, since the current running through that low ground was moving far too fast to risk it. Instead, I focused on cutting power to the shed, moving what vehicles and equipment I could reach, and recording timestamps for every structure and section of land as it went under, my boots filling with cold water long before I made it back to dry ground. Lenora appeared on the community road above the flood, standing at a safe distance, showing no urgency and no surprise at what was unfolding below her. I overheard her tell a nearby board member that the valley had finally cleaned itself up, said with the same satisfaction someone might use describing a finished renovation. When I asked her directly why the valve had been opened, she claimed it was an emergency decision made to protect homes worth millions of dollars. Even though not a single house in Cedar Ridge sat anywhere near a flood risk that night. She looked out over my drowning ranch and offered me a new number on the spot, saying she could still get me $10,000, but that tomorrow she might not offer anything at all. I understood in that moment that flooding my land had never been only about drainage or emergencies. She wanted me desperate enough to sign before any adjuster or engineer could even begin assessing what had actually happened. I told her no. She called me a man too proud to admit he had already lost, and drove off without offering a single hand to help move a single sandbag. When the water finally receded near dawn, I checked the server storing my primary camera footage and found that someone had accessed it remotely overnight and deleted the 11 most critical minutes of recording. By the next morning, the HOA's attorney had already issued a written statement calling the flooding an unavoidable act of nature, insisting the valve had only been opened to protect residents, and reminding everyone that I had knowingly purchased land in a floodplain for $1,000. Lenora held an informal press event right at the entrance to Cedar Ridge, telling a small crowd of residents that I had bought a bargain lot and was now trying to turn a natural disaster into a payday. In front of that same crowd, she referred to me as a failed speculator playing dress-up as a rancher, and several neighbors laughed along with her. I did not argue with her in public, because I already knew the argument that mattered would happen somewhere else entirely. Tate Holloway arrived to inspect the site later that week and confirmed what my sensors had already shown. The retention pond still had significant unused capacity at the time of the release. The emergency valve had not been necessary under any reasonable reading of the design specifications. The eastern discharge route had been deliberately blocked, and the new steel pipe aimed at my fence line did not appear anywhere on the approved engineering plans. Lenora quickly pivoted to blaming Cole Dillard, claiming he had made an independent technical decision without her knowledge or authorization. Cole stayed quiet during that first round of questioning, still collecting a paycheck from the HOA and clearly unwilling to contradict the woman who signed it. My own sensor logs told a precise story that no press conference could talk its way around. Rainfall intensity never reached a genuine emergency threshold. That night, the valve opened 47 minutes before the storm even reached its peak. The discharge flowed at close to maximum volume for an extended period, and the valve was only closed after my restored wetland had already been fully submerged. Lenora mocked the data publicly, insisting my equipment was uncertified backyard gadgetry that no court would ever take seriously. Tate confirmed instead that every sensor I had installed met recognized standards used across the hydrology field, undercutting her dismissal in front of the same residents she had been trying to reassure. What Lenora did not know was that my main camera had not been my only camera. An older trail camera, originally mounted for wildlife monitoring, had kept running independently through the entire storm, untouched by whoever had wiped the primary server. That backup camera captured her white SUV parked beside the valve housing at 1:39 in the morning, and it caught her stepping out of the vehicle wearing the same light-colored rain jacket seen earlier near Cole Dillard. I did not release that footage right away. My attorney, Avery Sloan, advised me to preserve it quietly and let Lenora keep talking, since every false statement she made in public was one more thing that would eventually work against her under oath. Not long after, Bancroft Leisure Development sent a fresh offer through their own legal counsel, raising the number to $75,000. The terms required me to waive every future claim, stay permanently silent about the cause of the flooding, and transfer my water rights entirely to the company. I refused without hesitation. Everett Bancroft himself called me directly, telling me a wise man would take the money now, before experts had a chance to prove the land was worthless anyway. When I asked why a major development company would care so much about supposedly worthless land, he ended the call almost immediately, and I understood exactly why the silence on the other end felt so uncomfortable. Avery laid a certified water rights document on his desk during our next meeting and told me plainly that everyone involved had misunderstood what I actually owned. They believed I had bought a stretch of mud for $1,000. But what the deed truly carried was control over a water right dating back to 1908. A priority claim older and stronger than almost anything else in that valley. Bancroft needed that exact water right to fill an artificial lake, irrigate a golf course, and supply an entire resort development, and without my signature, they would be forced into a far more expensive alternative water source. That single fact explained everything, from the forged urgency in Lenora's emails to the persistence of Bancroft's calls, because this had never been about land that nobody wanted. Avery's research into the title history revealed exactly why the water right carried so much leverage. Cedar Ridge sat at a higher elevation with no natural water source of its own, strong enough to fill a decorative lake or irrigate an entire golf course without drawing from somewhere downstream. My 1908 priority claim outranked nearly every other water right filed in that valley since, which meant Bancroft could not simply drill a new well or apply for a fresh permit and expect the state to grant it ahead of mine. Avery pulled the county water registry printouts and spread them across his conference table, tracing the chain of ownership back through 5 previous families who had each let the paperwork lapse into obscurity without ever losing the underlying priority date attached to it. He explained that water law in that state worked on a strict seniority system, meaning the oldest recorded claim always drank first, no matter how much money or influence stood behind a newer one. Bancroft's engineers had apparently discovered this same fact months earlier during their own due diligence, which was the real reason their interest in my supposedly worthless mud had never actually cooled. Beyond the water right, I also held a private conservation agreement with an environmental trust, one that paid annually for restoring wetland acreage, protecting a natural migration corridor, and improving water quality flowing out of Barrow Creek into the wider watershed. If that restoration work continued uninterrupted, the trust projected the ranch could generate meaningful conservation credit income for years into the future, a revenue stream that had nothing to do with real estate speculation and everything to do with patient environmental work. The flood undid nearly all of it in a single night. 2 years of soil restoration washed away, construction sediment buried sensitive wetland ground meant to stay undisturbed. My monitoring equipment was destroyed beyond repair, and the Conservation Trust immediately flagged the contract as being at risk of default through no fault of my own. Early estimates from restoration specialists placed the environmental repair cost above $7 million before anyone had even begun calculating the separate value of the water rights themselves or the lost conservation income. Lenora kept telling residents I was somehow conjuring millions out of a $1,000 purchase, repeating the phrase enough times that it started to sound rehearsed rather than genuinely confused. Avery offered a simple explanation whenever anyone raised the question in a deposition or a hallway conversation. If a person buys a rare painting at a garage sale for $1, the person who destroys that painting afterward does not only owe a single dollar in return, they owe whatever the painting was actually worth. Maris Keene chose that same week to hand over. The meeting minutes Lenora had specifically ordered her to delete. Minutes that captured Lenora saying plainly that I would never agree to sell as long as the land remained usable, that a single flood might finally push me past the point where I could afford to fight back, and that Bancroft would handle the rest once I no longer had the resources to resist. Email records between Lenora and an assistant working for Everett Bancroft surfaced shortly afterward, revealing a consulting arrangement promising her $300,000 once the ranch was successfully acquired. She had not yet collected the full amount, but bank records showed she had already received a $50,000 advance payment routed through a separate consulting entity registered in her name. Once Avery filed the formal complaint, our claims included property damage, environmental restoration costs, lost conservation contract income, punitive damages for intentional misconduct, and an injunction preventing the HOA from ever altering that drainage system again without proper county oversight. Lenora reportedly laughed when she first saw the total figure named in our filing, telling her own legal team that no judge would ever hand millions of dollars to a man who paid less for his land than most people pay for a television set. In her sworn written response, Lenora stated flatly that she had never been present at the retention pond on the night of the flood. The backup trail camera told a very different story, time-stamped and untouched, and it was waiting quietly for the moment it would matter most. During her deposition, Lenora kept the same dismissive posture she had carried from our very first conversation at my gate, describing me at various points as a man playing rancher with tax sale land, someone who could not afford real experts, and a failed man asking a wealthy community to fund his lifestyle. Avery never raised his voice or matched her tone, choosing instead to ask her to confirm each claim individually while she remained under oath, a method that proved far more damaging than any argument could have been. She insisted, one statement at a time, that she never ordered the valve opened, never went near the retention pond that night, knew nothing about Bancroft's private offer negotiations, and received no financial benefit whatsoever from the sale attempt. At one point she leaned toward the microphone and added, unprompted, that she found it almost insulting to be questioned this way over a piece of land that had cost less than her monthly landscaping bill. Avery let the comment sit in the record without responding to it, aware that every unnecessary word she added under oath was one more thread the truth would eventually pull loose. Avery answered each denial with documentation rather than confrontation, laying out GPS location data pulled from her vehicle, the backup camera footage from the retention pond, her email exchanges with Bancroft's team, bank records showing the $50,000 advance, and the deleted meeting minutes Maris had preserved. When the evidence became impossible to talk around, Lenora shifted the blame entirely onto Cole Dillard, insisting he had acted alone and outside any instruction from her office. Cole's own attorney warned him that he stood to absorb full personal liability if he continued protecting Lenora at his own expense, and that warning changed everything about his cooperation. He turned over a text message Lenora had sent him directly on the night of the storm, instructing him to open every south-facing valve and to keep them open until the Calder pasture was completely gone. A second message instructed him to disable the HOA's own camera system before taking any action at all. Cole confirmed under oath that Lenora had stood beside the valve housing herself that night, personally checking the flow before ever getting back into her vehicle, a detail that matched the backup footage precisely. Maris confirmed separately that Lenora had personally instructed her to alter the official meeting minutes to remove any mention of drainage changes discussed that week. A forensic technician hired by our side recovered deleted system logs showing the HOA's own security cameras had been disabled using Lenora's personal administrator credentials, that the valve itself had been unlocked using her individual access code, and that the resulting footage had been wiped from the server at 4:12 in the morning. Lenora's legal team continued arguing that she had acted only to protect Cedar Ridge residents from a legitimate flood risk. Tate returned to present a full flow modeling report showing the retention pond had never approached a dangerous threshold, that no home in the community was ever genuinely at risk, and that opening the south valve had actually increased overall danger rather than reducing it in any meaningful way. Everett Bancroft attempted to distance his company from the unfolding scandal, insisting through his attorneys that he had never authorized or even known about the flooding itself. Internal emails told a different story, showing his assistant had received photographs of my flooded ranch directly from Lenora during the early hours of that same night. Beneath one of those images, Lenora had written a short caption that read, quite simply, that now he would sell. Bancroft Leisure Development moved quickly to negotiate a separate private settlement of its own, quietly turning over internal documents in an effort to limit its own exposure and distance itself from Lenora entirely. Lenora slowly began to realize that the company she had worked so hard to please was using her as a shield rather than a partner. The Cedar Ridge Board eventually asked her to step down from her position, but she refused, still convinced that no jury would ever award serious money for damage done to land originally purchased for $1,000. Our independent damage assessment was finalized just before the trial date, and the total provable losses came in well above $18 million, a figure that did not yet include any consideration of punitive damages for conduct the evidence already showed was deliberate, coordinated, and calculated from the very beginning. The courtroom filled with Cedar Ridge residents, county representatives, environmental specialists, HOA board members, and attorneys representing Bancroft on the day the trial finally began. Lenora's defense strategy centered almost entirely on the original purchase price, with her attorney repeatedly asking why land bought for $1,000 could possibly generate millions of dollars in claimed damages. Avery methodically separated each category of loss for the jury, distinguishing the original auction price from the water rights independent value, the cost of restoring years of physical improvements, the environmental remediation obligations created by the flooding, and the conservation income lost through the broken trust agreement. Tate returned once more with detailed flow modeling, demonstrating conclusively that the water had not moved naturally, but had been redirected through a deliberately engineered sequence of actions. A forensic data specialist confirmed under cross-examination that neither the valve access logs nor the backup camera footage showed any signs of tampering or alteration after the fact. Maris read the withheld meeting minutes aloud into the record, her voice steady despite years of professional loyalty to the woman she was now testifying against. Cole confirmed once more, without hesitation this time, that Lenora had personally ordered the valve opened that night. The jury then watched the backup camera footage in full, showing Lenora standing beside the retention pond at exactly the time she had sworn under oath she was home asleep, her voice clearly audible telling someone nearby to let the water take everything, because by morning I would be the one begging to sell. Realizing the damage that testimony had caused, Lenora chose to take the stand herself in a final attempt to salvage her credibility with the jury. She insisted she had only ever been trying to protect hundreds of decent families from a man living out in the mud on the edge of their community. When Avery asked her directly whether she believed my ownership rights meant less because I had purchased the land cheaply, she answered without hesitation that a man who paid $1,000 had no standing to obstruct a 9-figure development project. That single sentence, spoken under oath in front of 12 jurors, revealed far more about her true motivation than any document ever could, confirming that her actions had never been about safety, only about clearing an inconvenient obstacle out of a very profitable path. Avery then introduced the $50,000 advance payment tied to Bancroft's consulting arrangement, which Lenora dismissed as an unrelated fee for unrelated work. Moments later, the jury saw the photograph of my flooded property with her own caption beneath it, the 4 words that undid whatever remained of her defense entirely. Her legal team had no credible explanation left to offer. The jury retired to deliberate, and Lenora spent the recess reassuring the remaining board members that the very worst outcome she faced was covering the original purchase price, along with a modest sum for fence repairs. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom during that wait, not saying much to anyone, watching Avery review his notes one final time while Tate quietly organized the flowcharts we would no longer need. The deliberation stretched into the late afternoon, long enough that several reporters who had been covering the case for the regional paper began pacing near the elevators, and long enough that Lenora's confidence started to visibly thin with every passing hour. When the jury returned, the foreperson did not look toward me at all. He turned directly to Lenora and stated, in a calm and unhurried voice, that the jury had found her conduct to be intentional, deceptive, and carried out in bad faith from beginning to end. The jury determined that Lenora and the HOA bore responsibility for property trespass, intentional destruction of protected wetland, fraud, deliberate interference with a legal contract, and unauthorized alteration of a regulated water system. Judge Miriam Hollis asked both parties to return the following week so she could formally read the finalized judgment into the court record, a judgment built entirely from documented, provable losses rather than any emotional appeal from either side. The total judgment came to $25 million, broken into carefully itemized categories that left no room for accusations of arbitrary punishment. $7.8 million was designated for restoring the land, the creek, and the wetland to something close to its former condition. $3.2 million covered destroyed equipment, fencing, drainage channels, and other physical structures lost in the flood. $4.5 million addressed the damaged water rights and the broken conservation contract, while $1.5 million covered ongoing expert costs, sediment remediation, and long-term environmental monitoring required to confirm the land had genuinely recovered. The remaining $8 million was assigned directly to Lenora as punitive damages, reflecting the jury's finding that her actions had been intentional and that she had actively worked to conceal evidence afterward. The HOA and other named parties shared responsibility for the remaining categories according to their individual level of involvement in the scheme. Judge Hollis additionally ordered that Cedar Ridge could never again modify its drainage system without prior county approval, placed the retention pond under permanent county oversight, required immediate restoration of the eastern discharge route, and referred the deleted footage and falsified records to investigators for further review. Lenora rose from her seat and insisted loudly that nobody could turn a $1,000 ranch into a $25 million debt. Judge Hollis answered evenly that the court had not placed a value on her arrogance, only on everything she had knowingly chosen to destroy. Lenora turned toward Everett Bancroft, searching for some kind of support, but his attorney announced on the spot that the company had already terminated its consulting arrangement with her entirely. The Cedar Ridge Board voted to suspend her from her position before the day was even over. The woman who had once told me I lacked the money to hire a real lawyer left that courtroom flanked by 3 attorneys of her own and carrying a judgment far heavier than anything she had ever imagined possible. Outside on the courthouse steps, Lenora asked me if I felt any satisfaction knowing I had destroyed an entire community over a piece of property nobody else had ever wanted. I told her the community had not opened that valve. She had. The payment of that judgment did not arrive all at once, since appeals, insurance negotiations, and asset recovery proceedings stretched the process out over many months that followed. A portion of the obligation was eventually covered by the HOA's liability insurance. A separate settlement negotiated with Bancroft Leisure Development, funds from the community's reserve account, and Lenora's own personal assets and future earnings. Once the court appointed an independent trustee to oversee fair repayment. That trustee also made sure innocent Cedar Ridge residents were not left to personally absorb the full weight of decisions they had never made or approved. A subsequent financial audit revealed Lenora had also diverted community funds toward lobbying efforts connected to the Bancroft project long before the flood ever happened. Everett Bancroft ultimately abandoned the golf course plan entirely, unable to secure the water rights his entire design had depended on from the very beginning. Cedar Ridge elected an entirely new board and negotiated a legitimate, fully permitted drainage agreement directly with the county, closing the door on the kind of unilateral decision-making that had caused all of this in the first place. Several residents who had once laughed along with Lenora's press event at the entrance gate later stopped by my property to apologize in person, admitting they had never questioned her version of events until the trial forced them to see the full record for themselves. I did not need those apologies to feel vindicated, but I appreciated the honesty behind them, especially from neighbors who had every reason to simply stay quiet and move on. I spent the majority of the settlement funds where they mattered most to me. I restored Barrow Creek properly this time, rebuilt a stronger flow control system designed to prevent this exact scenario from ever happening again, secured the long-term legal protection of my water rights, and established a small monitoring fund dedicated to the wetlands' ongoing health. I did not build a mansion, and I did not trade in my old work truck for anything flashier. I repaired the original farmhouse instead, kept the same worn truck Lenora had once mocked so openly, and went right back to the quiet, unglamorous work of tending land that had already proven its worth to anyone paying real attention. A year later, the pasture had turned green again, the creek ran clean past the new sensor stations, and herons had returned to the low ground in greater numbers than before the flood ever happened. At the front gate, I hung a small wooden sign that read Barrow Creek Ranch, purchased for $1,000, not for sale, and I meant every word of it. The last time I saw Lenora, she was carrying file boxes out of the old HOA office, her expression still carrying the same disbelief she had shown from the very first afternoon we met at my gate. She looked at me as though I had somehow stolen something from her, rather than simply refusing to hand over what had always been mine. I never felt the need to explain myself to her, not that day and not since. She had looked at a modest man in work clothes, an old truck and a bargain purchase price, and concluded that no one like that deserved real protection under the law. Some mornings now I still walk the fence line at first light, checking the same stretch of ground where the water first broke through, and I notice how ordinary it all looks again, grass and mud and fence wire behaving exactly as they should. Visitors who come out for the Conservation Trust's annual survey sometimes ask if I ever think about selling, now that the land has proven itself worth so much more than anyone once assumed. And I always give them the same answer, that some things are not for sale simply because someone finally offers the right number. She did not lose because the muddy ranch behind her subdivision turned out to be a hidden fortune worth millions. She lost because a person's ownership does not shrink simply because they were not wealthy when they claimed it. Barrow Creek Ranch cost me exactly $1,000 at auction, and the lesson Lenora Pritchard paid to finally understand that truth cost her $25 million in return. Lenora once believed rising water could wash me right off that land for good. In the end, the only thing the flood ever carried away was a kind of power she had never actually earned in the first place.